Welcome back again. Please comment down below what time it is, wherever you are right now, and press the like button. Let's get to it. He stepped out into the bright heat of Ocean Drive, a thin magazine in his hand, and started up the marble steps. Two cracks, close together, and Gianni Versace collapsed. The shooter turned, calm, blending into the street before slipping away. Who was he? Why Versace? How did a private spiral end on a designer's doorstep? Across America, 5 bodies marked the path, a city on edge. To understand the gunman, we need to go back into charm, humiliation, and a life built on borrowed names. Andrew Philip Cunanan arrived with words before stability. In classrooms, he was the gifted talker, a quick mimic, reading what adults wanted and reflecting it back with a polished smile. Teachers noted recall bordering on photographic, a flair for detail, and a habit. He would shape stories to fit the room. At home, volatility hummed beneath the surface. The psychology of the moment is important. Status and control were currency in that house. Affection was conditional, and winning meant being seen. His father, Modesto, chased upward mobility with relentless energy, selling the dream of comfort and belonging. For a while, the family lived it. A nice neighborhood, good schools, a feeling that they were climbing. But money built on unstable ground buckles. Under investigation for financial impropriety, Modesto fled to the Philippines abruptly, leaving behind debts, anger, and a son who had learned that image can be everything, and that image can vanish overnight. That exit was an erasure of stability. Andrew watched status collapse, and he internalized the lesson. Never be powerless, never be ordinary, never admit the fall. San Diego's social scene became his next stage. In Hillcrest and La Jolla, he cultivated older, wealthier circles, men with established lives and discretionary money, people who appreciated a charming dinner companion who knew the right wine, the right gallery opening, the right line from a French film. He was young, handsome, attentive, offering flattery as if it were a currency that never ran out. He adopted the cues of privilege, the brands, the restaurants, the casual confidence that suggests, I belong here. But belonging was leased, not owned. Identity inflation followed. He would shift backstories depending on who was listening. Stanford one night, cultural aristocracy the next, a military family background when it caught sympathy. Names and details bent around his needs. He used aliases for fun first, then for function. It was not simply lying for sport. It looked like survival, a way to hold off shame that gnawed every time the check came or the lease was due. Investigators later considered this pattern as foundational, grandiosity covering a deep fear of rejection, the kind that curdles into anger when exposed. Money flowed through his hands as quickly as it arrived. Gifts, trips, a rented lifestyle. When the support waned, he borrowed, leveraged favors, promised impossible returns. Friends described a magnetic presence in public and a thin-skinned volatility in private. If you questioned the narrative, he escalated, talk turning sharp, then apologetic, then extravagant. What stands out now in retrospect is that stress did not create the persona, it amplified it. Under pressure, he doubled down on the mask. Bridge relationships formed the fragile web that would later snap. In Minneapolis, he built connections with David Madsen, a successful architect with a careful, private demeanor, and Jeff Trail, a former Navy officer with a steady, protective streak. They represented anchors, men with careers, routines, and reputations. Around them, Andrew could stage a version of himself that looked stable. But anchors can become mirrors. They reflected back the gap between his performance and his reality. In 1996, the edges of his constructed life began to fray. He reportedly bragged about connections to fashion, to wealth, to high society, in ways that strained belief, even among tolerant friends. Some distanced themselves, others confronted him. The psychology of the moment is important here. Grandiosity can manage social risk until it meets formal rejection. Cut off from certain benefactors, told to move on by others, he felt something more dangerous than poverty, humiliation. In that frame, every goodbye was not just an end, it was an indictment. He took small steps that now read as precursors. He asked to crash on couches, burned bridges over trivial slights, escalated stories into threats. He flashed expensive tastes without resources to match. When confronted, he would pivot, reframe, then retaliate with gossip. The community held him at the margins, still invited sometimes, increasingly managed at arm's length. And yet, for all this, there were moments of quiet, intimate connection. late-night talks with David, protective advice from Jeff, attempts to help him stabilize. Those attempts mattered. They set the stage for the betrayal he would perceive later. Meanwhile, family ties remained fraught. A trip to the Philippines to see his father exposed a different kind of disillusion. The myth of a successful patriarch overseas crashed into a simpler reality, reduced circumstances, unfulfilled promises. If the father had staged his life, the son took notes. He returned to the United States with more resentment than repair, and a sharpened need to prove, to someone, that he still mattered. He curated a persona around intelligence and access. He would quote rare books, memorize menus, and collect gossip like evidence. The effect was intoxicating for newcomers, but for those who knew him longer, it became unsettling. In hindsight, friends later told reporters about tells, the practiced laugh, the way he would watch a room for the most important person, then recalibrate his story mid-sentence. He was performing belonging, and every successful performance reset the addiction. Substance use threaded through the period, not constant but present. It lubricated long nights and dulled the friction of his contradictions. Drugs and alcohol can flatten shame temporarily and then rebound it with interest. After binges, he would swing between generosity and rage, promising change, then asking for money. The debts were not just financial. He drew on emotional credit too, and those accounts approached their limits. By early 1997, he was talking about leaving San Diego behind, chasing something bigger, money in Minneapolis, opportunities in Chicago, a reset that would erase the past few messy months. He told different people different reasons for the trip. He packed light, carried stories heavier than his bags, and flew north with an itinerary only he knew. The button therefore pattern was already in motion. He needed to regain status, but he had burned too many bridges. Therefore, his next moves would need to be riskier. What nobody knew at the time was how quickly his frustration would harden. The fragile loyalty web, David's concern, Jeff's boundaries, acquaintances' patience, would be tested in close quarters. Control, for him, was not just about money, it was about narrative. Who gets to decide who Andrew is? Who gets to tell him no? The answers in Minneapolis would be brutal. When his network frayed, the violence began. In Minneapolis, his arrival did not raise alarms. It started with familiar faces, a few nights on couches, a plan that shifted depending on who asked. Friends sensed a change, less charm, more edge, a pressured cadence in his stories. The psychology of the moment is important. Humiliation sat close to the surface, and he needed someone to absorb it. David Madsen tried to keep distance but offered kindness. Jeff Trail, steady and blunt, pushed for boundaries. Those boundaries would be tested inside a quiet apartment on a Saturday night. April 26, 1997. David's loft, a clean space with tall windows and an orderly calm. Andrew insisted, "Jeff, come over," the way a story needs its final witness. What happened in that room was not recorded, but the aftermath drew a grim outline. Neighbors reported shouting, a thud against metal, another thud, then silence, then hurried movement. Investigators later found a blood pattern on the rug, spatter tracing an arc that suggested blunt force applied repeatedly, close in, personal. A claw hammer lay nearby, wiped once, poorly. The body, Jeff Trail, was pulled to the bedroom, placed beneath a rug, staged out of sight. Why the overkill? Investigators considered control and humiliation. Jeff had tried to protect David, and he had challenged Andrew's narrative before. Rage can look like punishment when a delusion is threatened. The staging hinted at panic and calculation colliding. Hide the evidence, buy time, keep David compliant. But here is the twist. David did not run. He stayed inside that apartment for hours with Andrew and the body of his friend, a fact that would generate debates, blame, and grief that never healed. By morning, they left together. Witnesses saw them exit the building, controlled, quiet, David carrying a bag, Andrew leading. Some describe David as anxious, others as resigned. Abduction dynamics are not always violent on the street. They are clamped by fear, threat, and hope that compliance will end it. They drove in David's red Jeep, the vehicle becoming a moving boundary, too close to jump, too public to scream. Friends called, left messages. Silence followed. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. Here it was immediate. They spent part of the next day near the Mississippi River, a wide, cold body of water that swallows sound. The location matters. Open space can feel like relief, but it isolates witnesses. On April 28th, a few miles downriver from the city center, a fisherman saw something out of place on the bank. Shoes. then a shape. David Madsen had been shot twice, once in the head, once in the back. The head wound suggested execution, the back wound suggested a shot during flight or staging to imply it. The autopsy added limited clarity, no prolonged restraint marks, no defensive wounds that could resolve the final minutes. Contested theories emerged. Was David complicit after the first murder, frozen by shock, then executed to sever a tie? Or was he a hostage throughout, coerced, then killed when he saw a chance to run? Investigators considered both. The timeline compressed. Jeff murdered late on the 26th. David killed early on the 28th. In between, Andrew pawned items, made calls, and moved with purpose. Control, humiliation, rage, each visible in the choices he made, but none definitive without his voice under oath. Forensic evidence provided the bones of the narrative. Fingerprints in David's apartment placed Andrew at the scene, beyond question. Neighbors described a man matching his build and voice. The hammer bore blood consistent with Jeff. Fibers from the rug transferred to Jeff's clothing, indicating post-mortem movement. Phone records showed calls attempted from David's line that went unanswered. The Jeep's tires picked up mud, consistent with riverbank soil. What stands out now in retrospect is how tightly the events packed into 48 hours, leaving little margin for intervention. Meanwhile, inside the community, dread spread fast. Word moved through bars, offices, and phones. Jeff is missing. David is not answering. Andrew is here. People locked doors, double-checked plans, looked over shoulders on night walks. The media stayed muted at first, cautious, waiting for official confirmation. Without national coverage, the circle felt like they were keeping a private storm at bay. But two bodies do not stay local for long. The stakes doubled, and so did the urgency. Minneapolis police coordinated with the FBI, but information traveled in packets, sometimes delayed by jurisdictional procedures. Andrew had a head start and a talent for slipping between versions of himself. He was already using David's Jeep, a moving billboard for a search that had not fully started. He drove, he ate, he slept, he scanned headlines that had not yet named him. That delay mattered. What nobody knew at the time was that the killings were not a culmination, they were a beginning. The psychology of escalation was in motion. Having crossed the boundary into lethal violence, he found tactical advantage in it. Fear silences, murder erases witnesses, stolen vehicles extend range. He told himself a story about control, and now the evidence aligned with it. The next target would not resolve a grievance. It would confirm a pattern. In the aftermath of Jeff and David's deaths, friends faced a crushing calculus. Grief complicated by questions. Could they have stopped it by pushing him out earlier? Did attempts to help enable proximity? These are unfair burdens, but they linger in cases like this. The real weight falls on the brutality inside that loft and along that river, where two lives ended because a man demanded absolute control over the story of himself. With two dead, he did not slow down, he accelerated. While that was happening in Minneapolis, a different life moved on its precise schedule in Chicago. Lee Miglin, a respected real estate developer, left notes for the day, returned calls, and prepared for a routine weekend. He was known for discipline, philanthropy, and a quiet demeanor. On May 4th, 1997, that routine fractured. His wife, Marilyn, returned from a business trip and sensed something off. Messages unanswered, a house too still. The garage told the story first, and then there was the body. Stakes come into focus when order breaks. Lee was found bound with duct tape, his face wrapped, his wrists secured, his ankles immobilized. The brutality was not rushed. He suffered multiple stab wounds, and there were signs of beating, torture, and overkill. In a pristine garage, meticulous by design, the violence looked deliberate, rehearsed. The psychology of the moment is important. This was not a chaotic burglary, it was domination. Investigators considered two paths: forced entry by a stranger, or access gained through familiarity. What stands out now in retrospect is that certain details contradicted a simple break-in. There was no conventional ransacking inside the home. Items of value remained. Yet Andrew Cunanan took very specific things. Lee's green Lexus, personal effects, and later, credit cards that would ping far from Chicago. But here is the twist. The connection between Miglin and Cunanan was never conclusively established. Rumors circulated, chance meeting, prior acquaintance, a targeted approach based on perceived status, but police never verified a relationship. We are left with a chilling mystery. Why this house? Why this man? Control was the through line. The duct tape suggested staging and prolonged dominance, the kind that humiliates. The injuries suggested anger, arguably more than necessary to kill. Investigators considered a motive rooted in rage at status denial. Cunanan repeatedly excluded from elite circles, now punishing a symbol of establishment success. It is an analogy detectives often use. When you cannot enter the castle, you attack the gate. Yet, without a known link, this remains inference, not proof. Forensic evidence provided realities that did not depend on speculation. Tape residue on Lee's face and limbs, consistent with the same brand of material found in the garage supply. A knife from the home's own tools. Blood patterns on the concrete showed directionality, consistent with movement during the assault. There were partial prints lifted from the Lexus and the garage surfaces, later matched to Cunanan through comparison with his known prints from Minneapolis. The path hardened. Minneapolis to Chicago, two scenes of intimacy turned into instruments of death. Theft is often noisy, but this theft was strategic. Cunanan took the Lexus, equipped with a phone. He used Lee's credit cards to purchase gas and food along the route east and then south, leaving a breadcrumb trail that investigators could finally follow in real time. Why use traceable cards after two murders? Investigators considered a mix of arrogance and need. He needed speed and comfort, and he may have believed that speed would outpace coordination. In 1997, interagency communication was not instantaneous. Alerts took time, databases refreshed slowly. Toll booth cameras were not connected. Media attention spiked. A prominent Chicago figure, murdered in his home, bound and stabbed, now tied to an active double homicide suspect from Minneapolis. This changed the scale. National coverage named Andrew Cunanan showed his photo and described him as armed and dangerous. The message reached gas stations, hotel lobbies, airport counters. But mobility was his advantage. While the public learned his face, he drove through towns where the name meant nothing yet. There is a human moment worth holding. Marilyn Miglin stood outside her home, ringed by cameras, refusing to feed rumor, speaking only of her husband's humanity. Grief collided with public fascination, and investigators tried to shield her while extracting every possible detail about the last known movements. She insisted on dignity, an anchor against the spectacle building around the case. Inside the investigation, tension grew around victimology. The first two victims, Jeff Trail and David Madsen, fit a known circle, men in the gay community connected to Cunanan. Lee Miglin, older, straight, a high-profile developer, did not fit that pattern cleanly. Profilers debated, was this expansion random, or had Cunanan always targeted symbols of power, using proximity where he could find it? Profiles are maps, not destinations. Here, the map started to blur. Meanwhile, the Lexus turned into an accelerant. License plate readers were rare, but credit card transactions lit up in sequence. Indiana, then farther east, then a pivot. He eventually abandoned certain habits, but first, he enjoyed the car's anonymity, its speed, and its connections to a life he had always performed. A luxury brand, a leather interior, a smooth engine. In hindsight, it reads as theatre he directed for himself. Ride high after the humiliation in Minneapolis. Reenact control. Keep moving. What nobody knew at the time was that Cunanan's logistical adaptation would soon outpace the dragnet. He used payphones, paid cash when spooked, and rotated between visible risk and calculated restraint. He watched news in motel rooms, gauging where his name landed, and which cities were already scanning for him. One detail would prove crucial later: the Lexus's onboard phone. When he realized it could be tracked, his behavior shifted sharply. In the aftermath, Chicago police worked with the FBI to stitch timelines, canvass the neighborhood, and test any theory that linked victim and killer. None solidified. The public narrative held contradictions, whispers of acquaintance, official silence. And yet, for all this, the evidence of escalation was plain. The violence was more ritualized, the theft more strategic, the trail more national. This was the moment everything changed for the manhunt. The stolen car turned a regional search into a national pursuit, a moving signal that law enforcement could almost follow, but not quite catch. While the Lexus carried him out of Chicago, the investigation finally caught up to the idea that speed could be traced. The onboard phone became a liability. Calls could be triangulated, locations inferred, and the net, though slow, was knitting together. The psychology of the moment is important. When control feels threatened, he simplified. He needed a vehicle without a beacon, fuel without a receipt, movement without a signature. New Jersey, May 9th, 1997. A quiet cemetery in Pennsville, trimmed grass, headstones aligned, a caretaker working a routine morning. William Reese was 33, a husband, a father, a man whose work asked for steady hands and gentle attention. The stakes were painfully ordinary: a paycheck, a truck, a list of tasks before noon. He wasn't part of any social circle Cunanan knew. He hadn't crossed him, insulted him, or rejected him. He was in the wrong place, holding keys that solved a problem. The action unfolded with terrible efficiency. Investigators reconstructed it from timing, witnesses, and the crime scene itself. The Lexus appears, the driver steps out, a brief exchange, then movement into a maintenance area. There was no ritualized staging, no extended domination, no elaborate humiliation. A single gunshot, close range. William Reese died where he worked. His pickup truck, a red Chevy, disappeared within minutes, rolling out of the cemetery toward the highway. The Lexus, the symbol of a previous life and a fresh murder, was left behind, doors closed, as if the scene should remain tidy. What stands out now in retrospect is the contrast. In Minneapolis and Chicago, violence had felt intimate, suffused with rage, even theater. Here, it was instrumental, focused, pragmatic. Investigators considered what this shift meant. He wasn't escalating brutality for its own sake. He was adapting. Survival mode had clicked in. Kill, replace the car, move. It is an analogy used in manhunt briefings. A fugitive sheds identifiers like a snake, sheds skin, leaving the old version behind to mislead predators. Forensic evidence tied the cemetery to the spree with clinical clarity. The ballistic signature matched the .40 caliber weapon used in earlier murders. Casings stamped with the same manufacturer, ejection marks consistent with the same semi-automatic. Tire impressions near the maintenance building lined up with the Lexus's tread, later confirmed when the car was processed. Witness descriptions converged. An athletic man, dark hair, calm, not hurried, as if he had rehearsed this exact exchange in his head before driving in. The impact rippled in two directions. For William Reese's family, grief was immediate and incomprehensible. A random erasure, a husband and father taken because a stranger needed a truck. For law enforcement, the case shifted shape. This wasn't targeted vengeance, it was opportunistic procurement. The man they were hunting could depersonalize his victims at will, turning human lives into logistics. That raised the stakes for the public. Anyone, anywhere, could be pulled into his path if they possessed what he needed. Coordination problems surfaced in the hours that followed. The Lexus was found, yes, but statewide alerts on the stolen Chevy lagged. Radio dispatches carried the update. Databases took time to refresh, and not every patrol car had the same information at the same hour. Toll plazas saw a blur of red trucks each minute. Cameras recorded, but retrieval required requests, and requests took time. The but divided by therefore pattern repeated. The suspect changed vehicles. Therefore, the description changed. The description changed. Therefore, the dragnet stumbled. Media finally locked onto the name with full force. National broadcasts showed Cunanan's photograph, alongside images of Lee Miglin's home, David Madson's riverbank, Jeff Trail's smile, and now a cemetery in New Jersey. The map on screen drew a diagonal wound across the country. Fear spread across states, not in a wave, but in jolts. Phone calls to loved ones, bosses reminding staff to lock doors, motel clerks studying every check-in. Please leave a like and subscribe for daily true crime stories. There was a human moment inside a gas station later that day. A clerk watched a man pay cash, fill a red pickup, and keep his head low. He remembered the eyes, calm but depleted, the kind of fatigue that follows adrenaline. He only connected it after the news looped the man's face for the 10th time. In hindsight, missed opportunities weren't always neglect. They were the product of timing and fear of being wrong in the moment. Meanwhile, the red truck pointed south. Why Miami? Investigators considered his affinity for scenes where anonymity blends with spectacle. South Beach offered both: transients, cash economies, and crowds that don't ask questions. The center of gravity shifted. He had the vehicle, the weapon, and the habit of vanishing into public places. With the cemetery behind him and a city ahead that thrived on movement, Andrew Cunanan drove toward a coastline where the hunt would finally tighten. Miami received him the way it receives thousands each week, with heat, humidity, and anonymity. South Beach in late May was loud on the surface and loose underneath, a place where people arrived with stories no one checked. The red Chevy blended into a mosaic of rental cars and delivery trucks. He parked near the ocean, stepped into a crowd that didn't know his name, and exhaled like a man who believed he had outrun a headline. The stakes were different here. This wasn't Minneapolis, where a small circle watched each other, or Chicago, where a name meant something on every block. South Beach was transient. Residents rotated through sublets and weekly rentals. The psychology of the moment is important. If you need to disappear, choose a city where staying visible is another form of invisibility. He found cheap motels with lax ID checks, rooms with thin towels and thicker curtains, and he learned the rhythm of the streets by listening. Cash burn began immediately. Pawn slips accumulated, each one a small admission that he had run out of favors. Jewelry, watches, and clothes moved across counters for bills that vanished into rent, food, and the occasional club cover. Clerks remembered a man who knew the value of items too well, who insisted on quick transactions, who kept sunglasses on longer than the clouds required. He rotated shops to avoid patterns, but patterns formed anyway. The way footprints appear, even when you think you are walking on stone, sightings turned into a chorus. He ate at diners where night workers ordered eggs after midnight. He drank at clubs where the bass covered conversations and faces blurred into a shared sweat. He slept in rooms that smelled like bleach and ocean air, the combination that tells you the staff is quick and the windows are rarely opened. A bartender remembered a calm posture, precise orders, and a wallet that appeared and disappeared like a card trick. He sat with people who thought he was passing through, which was true, just not in the way they assumed. Investigators considered the problem of the unsheltered city. Miami's open architecture is a challenge for surveillance. Open streets, beach access, crowds that move like tides. Tips came in waves. He was spotted on Collins Avenue, then maybe on Lincoln Road, then at a pawn counter on Washington. Each lead aged quickly. By the time a call was routed and a patrol car swung by, he was gone. Meanwhile, he watched the local news with the volume low, checking whether the man in the mirror still matched the photo on screen. What stands out now in retrospect is how close the net came without touching him. A pawn ticket carried a name, sometimes invented, sometimes real, and a fingerprint in smudge form that didn't match cleanly in the system. A front desk clerk took cash and shrugged at a missing driver's license. A neighbor saw a red truck but didn't clock the plate. And yet, for all this, the city felt him. People in the community traded warnings. Lock doors, keep an eye out, call if you are unsure. He adjusted routines. Daylight meant errands, night meant movement. He found a rhythm. Sell small items, eat something cheap, sit by the water to plan. The oceanfront anonymity worked on him like a sedative. He could be anyone near the shoreline, another figure staring at waves. But here is the twist. The same shoreline hosted a regular, a man whose routine was public, known, and fixed. Gianni Versace took his morning walk on Ocean Drive, collected his newspapers, and returned to Casa Casuarina with a quiet efficiency that locals could set their watches by. Why stay 8 weeks, with pressure mounting? Investigators considered humiliation fermenting into spectacle. He had fled, adapted, and survived, but survival alone wouldn't satisfy the story he told himself. Fame sat across the street, visible, perfect for a final performance. He had spent years borrowing status from proximity, and now proximity offered the ultimate stage. The psychology of the moment is important. Narcissistic injury seeks repair not through apology, but through display. Missed opportunities multiplied, and they weren't all systemic. A patrol officer glanced twice at a man on a bench, recognized nothing, and kept driving. A hotel maid noticed a room left too tidy, drawers empty, hanger marks without clothes, and thought only of turnover. A pawn shop camera captured his profile, but the tape sat in a back office until a detective asked for it days later. Coordination improved, but improvement lagged behind motion. He traded the red truck for distance by hiding it in plain sight, parking it among others near marinas and construction sites. The truck became background noise in a city with constant deliveries. One detail would matter later: a roll of newspapers, neatly arranged in the passenger seat on certain mornings, suggesting he watched routines and rehearsed his own. He visited a bookstore, read magazines without buying, and studied faces of men who would never learn his name. Meanwhile, Versace's routine didn't change. He lived with purpose, even at home. Work in the morning, meetings in the afternoon, friends in the evening. Security in Miami wasn't what it would become after, because at the time, celebrity felt safer in public spaces than reality would soon prove. He greeted staff, waved to locals, and treated the street as an extension of his courtyard. Fame is loud, but daily life is quiet. That quiet made him reachable. A micro-story from a cafe. A server remembers two men at different tables. One flipped through a fashion magazine, pausing at the Versace spread. The other signed a bill with a flourish, a familiar face in the neighborhood. They never looked at each other. Or maybe they did, through reflections in the glass. In hindsight, proximity reads like inevitability, but at the time, it was just 2 mornings crossing. By early July, tips turned sharper. A pawn slip matched his known pattern. A witness described the same calm eyes. The red truck popped up on a side street, then vanished again. Law enforcement increased patrols quietly, not wanting to spark panic along Ocean Drive. They made lists: motels with cash acceptance, pawn shops within a 10-block radius, dumpsters where someone might ditch clothing or a bag. The lists helped, but lists don't look back. He grew thinner. Cash grew tighter. The calm calcified. He had stopped calling anyone weeks earlier, even from payphones, severing lines that could betray him. He lived in the present tense, and the present tense in Miami was warm, crowded, and forgiving of strangers. And yet, for all this, he was running out of moves. On a July morning, the sun lifted fast. The sidewalks dried from an early rinse, and the city settled into its ritual. He watched a doorway on Ocean Drive, measured footsteps, and waited for a moment that would bind his name to a legend. The paths finally crossed. The morning was ordinary, which is why it is unsettling. Sun on stucco, the sound of waves just beyond the palms. Casa Casuarina standing like a stage set that never closes. Gianni Versace left his gate shortly after 8, walked the short block to the news cafe, and picked up the magazines he favoured. Fashion, architecture, Italian newspapers. He greeted a few familiar faces, turned back toward the marble steps, and climbed with relaxed certainty. The shooter had already chosen the angle. Stakes were layered. Versace wasn't just a public figure. He was a working artist at the height of his powers, a partner, a brother, an employer. Outside the gate, staff moved through routines, a gardener trimming, a guard glancing at the sidewalk, tourists drifting with cameras. Inside, a family day was forming. The psychology of the moment is important. Routine gives a sense of invulnerability, and in that calm, danger can stand 10 feet away without a ripple. The action took seconds. 2 shots, close range, .40 caliber, the first striking behind the left ear, the second impacting near the cheekbone. Versace dropped to the steps, magazines scattering, blood staining the marble that had welcomed him home 100 times. The shooter turned, not in panic, but with a practiced exit, moving south along Ocean Drive, melting into the crowd in a grey tee and cap, holding the pistol low and tight. Witnesses froze, then shouted. A dove flapped from the courtyard fountain, as if even the birds registered the rupture. Unknown to them, across the water, a caretaker noticed something off. A small 2-story houseboat, usually quiet, now had a door ajar and a new padlock he did not recognize. Inside, he heard movement where no tenant was expected. He stepped back, called police, and waited on the dock as humidity built like pressure in a sealed room. Stakes tightened fast. Officers sealed the block, then the canal, then the neighborhood. Boats idled with engines low. Helicopters kept distance to avoid spooking whoever was inside. Residents watched from windows as tactical teams formed, slow, deliberate, careful. The psychology of the moment is important. Cornered fugitives can be desperate, but they can also be precise. The action moved in on a small scale, measured in inches. Officers stacked at the door, announced, then breached. Inside, a cramped living room, a couch with impressions, clippings about Gianni Versace, scattered on a table, cash in small stacks, food wrappers, and a mirror angled for line of sight to the hallway. A single gunshot cracked from the back bedroom. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. They advanced, clearing tight corners, then found the body on the floor against the bed. The same. .40 caliber semi-automatic lay nearby. Forensic evidence started writing its final chapter. The firearm's serial number had been removed, but the ballistic signature matched the earlier murders. Spent casing, extractor marks, breech face impressions were identical. A canvas bag held clothes, a few coins, a passport photo, and a tiny notebook with names scratched out. Autopsy notes later drew a sober picture. No recent heavy cocaine levels, despite rumors. An empty stomach. Dehydration, consistent with weeks of strain and spotty meals. Abrasions on knuckles, no defensive wounds. Death was instant, the muzzle placed at the mouth. The act was controlled. Investigators considered whether he planned suicide all along if trapped. The evidence suggested a contingency, not a fantasy. Impact arrived with the sound of the second siren wave. Medical, crime scene techs, supervisors. No trial, no sworn answers, only evidence and inference. The houseboat became a reliquary of absence. Clippings about Versace, a radio tuned to news, a bed slept in lightly. Outside, the tape fluttered in marine wind while a city tried to exhale. With the shooter dead, the questions grew louder. In the aftermath, grief took separate shapes in 5 homes. Jeff Trail's family faced the logistics of a military funeral, and the burden of a private man turned into a headline. David Madsen's parents fielded questions they could not answer, about timelines and choices, about a riverbank that would not let go. In Chicago, Marilyn Miglin protected her husband's legacy from rumor, focusing on his work, his tenderness, and the quiet routines they shared. In Pennsville, New Jersey, William Reese's wife and child lived with a loss that felt arbitrary. Keys, a truck, and then a life erased. In Miami, Donatella and Santo Versace moved through shock into duty, anchoring a global company while mourning a brother whose work was still on the mannequins. What stands out now, in retrospect, is the legal weight that followed grief. Estates needed settling. Insurance claims required documentation that insisted on details no one wanted to relive. And civil actions occasionally tested boundaries with media companies or landlords. Some families pursued victim compensation funds, others refused interviews entirely, guarding memory from the market. The psychology of the moment is important. Public tragedy demands answers, but families sometimes need quiet more than closure. Law enforcement reviewed the chase in slow motion. Interagency lag mattered, alerts posted hours late, vehicle descriptions updating unevenly, pawn slips sitting in back rooms until someone connected them. The FBI's 10 most wanted designation came, but speed did not always translate into proximity. In Miami, officers acknowledged missed chances, a pawn ticket that could have triggered a targeted sweep, a motel clerk's tip that aged out. A red truck nobody recognized as stolen because its plate never pinged in time. None of it changes culpability, but it explains how a fugitive hid in plain sight. Myths gathered quickly around motive. Tabloids speculated about secret meetings, whispered about fashion world vendettas, and drew lines between Versace and Cunanan that evidence never secured. Police never proved they had met. Theories multiplied anyway. Shared spaces at clubs in San Francisco, an introduction at a party, a passing glance upgraded by fantasy into a relationship. Investigators considered these stories, interviewed witnesses, cross-referenced calendars. Nothing fixed. This is the chilling mystery at the center. A symbolic target, likely chosen from distance, turned into a personal grievance by a man whose identity depended on proximity to power. Psychological autopsy added structure where facts thinned. Clinicians who study violence described a profile built around narcissistic injury, grandiosity, chronic lying, and rage at rejection, compounded by financial collapse and social exile. The performance mattered. He did not just kill, he curated scenes that displayed dominance, duct tape, and overkill. In Chicago, an execution-style shot by the river, a public assassination on marble steps. In that reading, murder became theatre, humiliation inverted into temporary control. But here is the twist. The Reese killing in New Jersey breaks the pattern. Instrumental, fast, indifferent. That contrast shows a man capable of switching motive frames to maintain movement. Media narratives split. Some outlets glamorize the fugitive's improvisation, giving him the anti-hero sheen reserved for outlaws. Others centered the victims, insisting on names before the gunmen's. Community leaders in Minneapolis and Miami pushed back against sensationalism that edged into stereotype about gay life, insisting on accuracy and respect. The late 1990s were not gentle about stigma. Fear inside LGBTQ spaces tightened, not only from the threat of violence, but from the way coverage could turn vulnerability into spectacle. Security culture shifted. Celebrity routines grew less predictable. Residential protections increased. Cameras, varied routes, staff training. Police departments in major cities updated protocols for multi-jurisdiction pursuits, adding faster data sharing and uniform alerts. Pawn networks were mapped and monitored more aggressively. Small changes, incremental, but they matter. They are the guardrails built from specific mistakes. Families lived with anniversaries. Memorial services brought flowers, but also questions that returned like weather. Could we have seen this coming? Why that morning? Why that garage? Why that riverbank? Those questions do not resolve, they soften. Some relatives found purpose in advocacy, speaking about interagency communication or victim dignity. Others went quiet, keeping memories in the smaller rooms of the house, away from microphones. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery, in the space where proof ends and interpretation begins. Did Cunanan intend Versace specifically from the moment he reached Miami, or did the idea harden over weeks as he watched the routine? Investigators considered both possibilities, noting the clippings, the proximity, and the timing. Absent testimony, the best we have is pattern, a man whose life was performance closing with a killing staged for maximum attention. And what does it mean when fame and anonymity collide so violently? It means the public square is not neutral. It means icons are still people on morning walks, and strangers can map their routes. It means humiliation, when left to fester without treatment or accountability, can become a script written in other people's blood. The city healed, but not back to what it was. It healed into something more cautious, more guarded, and more aware of the cost of delay. Let's get to story number 2. The bathroom microphone captured it, barely a whisper, that said, "Killed them all, of course," as an arrest warrant was already in motion. Investigators had spent decades triangulating silence. A missing wife, a dismembered neighbor, a slain confidant. A family fortune shielded him. A pattern of erasure followed him, and he kept walking free. To understand how a New York real estate heir reached that moment, we need to go back 1970s Manhattan, a young medical student named Kathie, and a marriage that started bright, then fractured in the shadows. Robert Durst was born into a dynasty that built steel and glass into money, reputation, and leverage. The Durst organization shaped the New York skyline, and with it came pressure, expectations to conform, to perform, to pass the empire forward without scandal. At the time, Robert's place inside that machine was uneasy. He was the eldest son, but he didn't act like a corporate heir. He drifted toward isolation, toward odd routines, toward distances that felt deliberate. The psychology of the moment is important. As a child, he experienced a parental loss that scarred the family fabric, and rivalry with his brother grew into a quiet, permanent tension. What stands out now, in hindsight, is how that pressure collided with detachment. Friends remembered Robert as intelligent and aloof, quick with details, slow with warmth. He could be charming, then cold. He could be generous, then withholding. In a family that prized control, he seemed to choose opacity, and yet he didn't live as a recluse. He moved downtown, he met people, he dated. That is how he met Kathie McCormack. Kathie was young, ambitious, and focused. She was finishing medical training, working through long nights and harder weeks, pushing toward a career that would give her freedom and identity. She was also drawn to the world Robert represented: wealth, access, a different orbit than the one she came from. They connected quickly. They married. It looked like a power pairing, the heir with resources and the student with drive. But beneath the photographs and dinner parties, there were fractures forming. The early domestic rhythm felt odd to friends. There were reports of control, isolation, volatility. People close to Kathie said she sometimes appeared with bruises, that her explanations felt thin, that she seemed afraid to say more. The psychology of the home matters in these cases. Abuse often lives behind closed doors, protected by money, normalized by routine. What if a pattern was already in place, one that mixed jealousy with domination? Investigators later considered that possibility. At the time, the couple presented as complicated but functional. They had a lake house, they hosted, they traveled. Meanwhile, Robert, standing inside the family empire, was strained. He worked, then drifted. He pushed back against his father's decisions and against the idea that he should be an eager lieutenant. His brother's ascent aggravated the rivalry. For a man who craved control but avoided responsibility, a wife moving toward independence could feel like a threat. When Kathie moved deeper into her clinical work, the gap widened. She was often at the hospital. She had plans to finish, specialize, and, according to friends, consider her options if the marriage didn't stabilize. By the early 1980s, the tension escalated. There was an alleged incident at a party, loud enough that people still talk about the mood change afterward. Police were called to the home more than once, according to later reports. Money became a lever: how it was given, how it was withheld, how it set the terms of daily life. Friends say Kathie started to talk about divorce, about getting her own place, about making sure she had access to money she felt she was owed. The stakes were clear. Her career depended on stability and time, and his resources could either help or constrain her. This is where the human element sharpens. Think about a medical student in her final stretch, exhausted, proud, and trapped in a marriage she couldn't fully predict. Think about a wealthy husband who didn't like to lose and didn't like to be questioned. Arguments, even small ones, cut deeper. Control escalates when someone senses a loss of power. In hindsight, the pattern looks familiar. Isolation, intimidation, then a pivot to sudden calm. Her friends noticed the swings. 3 days earlier, something unusual and unsettling occurred in their marriage. Pressure collided with fear. This wasn't a fight about chores. It was about separation, about money, about what she could say to others. She reached out to friends more urgently. She asked for help. They worried about what might happen next. Because the volatility felt sharper, the timing worse. She needed to be in class, to be on rounds, to keep her resume intact. And yet she was pulled into arguments that left marks, visible and invisible. What nobody knew at the time was how quickly a life can turn from crowded to empty. When a person disappears, the erasure is immediate, but the investigation is slow. But before we get there, the stakes need to be clear. Kathie's entire future, her medical career, her independence, hung in the balance of a marriage she couldn't repair. Robert had the means to hire lawyers, to manage narratives, to outlast scrutiny. She had friends, courage, and a clock that was running out. Now lay the family shadow over all of it. The Dursts didn't just have money, they had institutional weight, legal teams, and the ability to make problems quiet. That kind of influence doesn't write the ending, but it can shape the opening chapters. In this case, when the tension peaked, the world outside the marriage wasn't ready for the storm brewing inside. The last weeks were filled with red flags, calls for help, plans to leave, and a husband whose moods sharpened as control slipped away. What happened the night Kathie vanished? That question becomes the spine of everything that followed, because once the erasure began, each silence would be filled by a different story. Late January 1982, a Sunday night turning into Monday. The timeline is tight, the details contested. Kathie was reportedly last seen at the lake house earlier that weekend, then back in Manhattan by Sunday. Friends remember frantic calls, fear in her voice, a request to come over. She had been planning to attend a dinner with classmates that evening, then return to her apartment, then be at her medical rotation first thing Monday morning. She never arrived for rounds. The silence began. Robert's account hardened quickly. He said he put her on a Manhattan-bound train from Westchester that night, that she returned to the city, and that he later went to a friend's house. He mentioned a call from Kathie to the dean of her medical school, claiming she wouldn't be in. This is the anchor of his narrative, a call that would become a fault line. The psychology of the moment is important. Alibis, once repeated, turn into memory. Meanwhile, friends sensed trouble. One friend, deeply worried, made multiple calls. When Kathie didn't appear on Monday, panic moved from private to public. At the school, her absence was noticed immediately. Medical training runs on clockwork. Miss one shift, and someone calls, miss two, and questions get formal. The alleged call to the dean stood out because it didn't align with her habits, her work ethic, or the tone of her recent messages. Why would a student so close to graduation casually skip a critical rotation? Action followed, slow at first. Police did a welfare check. The apartment felt off, some scattered items, no clear sign of a struggle, but unsettling in the way silence is unsettling. Investigators considered voluntary disappearance, a common early misstep in missing adult cases. Friends pushed harder, bringing notes, photographs, dates. They had their own mini-case files, built from years of late-night conversations and visible bruises, from sudden changes in her plans and frightened remarks after arguments. In hindsight, this was evidence, not gossip, but the investigation drifted. The family's shadow loomed over early steps. Detectives came and went. Timelines were sketched, then redrafted. The question of the train dominated. Did he drive her to the station? Did she board? Did anyone see her arrive in Manhattan? No conductor remembered her. No taxi driver came forward. No neighbor placed her at the Riverside apartment after that night. Without a body, the case lacked the forensic anchors that force action. And yet, the absence itself was a form of evidence. A person on the verge of finishing medical school doesn't erase herself. Robert's movements, as he recounted them, were neat. He said he got back to the city, went to a friend's place, made calls. The times were plausible, the specifics were thin. What stands out now, in hindsight, is that each point could be true on paper, but hollow in practice. Meanwhile, the alleged call to the dean lingered, a single, convenient fact that explained the next day's silence. Investigators later considered whether someone else placed that call. using familiarity with her life to make it sound credible. Stakes sharpened as days turned into weeks. Kathie's friends, mostly women in medicine, understood patterns of coercion. They pressed the NYPD, wrote down anything that felt relevant, and visited the apartment again. They found routine objects still in place, things a person takes when leaving for good: makeup, study materials, winter gear. These details matter. When someone vanishes without a trace, the toothbrush left behind is louder than a confession. Press attention arrived, then receded. A missing adult in New York, married to wealth, tied to a family that disliked public spectacle. Reporters sensed a story, then hit a wall. The police response felt uneven, a combination of overwork and caution. And yet, within the social circle, whispers hardened into statements. Domestic abuse, financial control, threats. Friends remembered a night at the hospital when Kathie stayed over after a fight. They remembered the last calls, her voice thin, urgent, not dramatic, just tired and scared. The psychology of the moment is important. Victims warn the world in fragments. Durst repeated his version, calmly. He had taken her to the train. He believed she had gone back to the city. He said he wasn't with her after that. He cooperated selectively, hired counsel, and lived inside the protection money can buy. Time, private investigators, a buffer from direct pressure. The lack of immediate forensic evidence worked in his favor. No body, no scene, no definitive proof. The case began to cool, but here is the twist. As the official file dulled, an unofficial archive grew. Kathie's friends saved letters, notes about conversations, names of people she feared, places she had planned to go if she left. They were not detectives, but they understood pattern, and one name kept appearing: Susan Berman, a confidant in Los Angeles, a writer with a keen sense for loyalty, money, and secrets. The connection wasn't casual. Susan knew the marriage, the arguments, the stakes. In parallel, small investigative threads remained open. The phone logs around the alleged call, the timing of Robert's movements that night and into Monday, the absence of hospital staff who heard from Kathie. None of it proved homicide, but each piece chipped away at the train story's solidity. In cases like this, missing person logic is like a bridge. Remove enough bolts, it collapses under its own weight. What nobody knew at the time was how long the silence would hold. Months turned into years. The file changed hands. Some detectives considered foul play, others parked the case. The family influence didn't disappear, but it stopped being decisive. There just wasn't enough to force a reckoning. Meanwhile, those closest to Kathie marked birthdays without candles, anniversaries without answers. Then, a critical pivot. The idea that someone helped create the alibi surfaced, quietly. If the call to the dean wasn't Kathie, who had the knowledge and motive to place it? Access mattered. Style mattered. The voice of someone who could sound authoritative, who could make a dean accept a short explanation. Susan Berman's name moved from the social column to the investigative notes. In the aftermath of that winter, the narrative froze. Officially, she was a missing person, presumed alive at first, then presumed dead. Unofficially, people spoke about a homicide without a body. The erasure felt deliberate, silence where there should have been noise, a neat alibi where there should have been chaos. And, in Los Angeles, a confidant held a secret she would never testify about. Susan Berman grew up in shadows cast by money and violence. Her father, Davy Berman, was tied to organized crime in Las Vegas, a world where loyalty was currency and silence was survival. She turned that background into writing, publishing memoir and journalism, but the imprint of secrecy remained. When she met Robert Durst in the 1970s, she recognized something familiar: affluence mixed with isolation, intelligence wrapped in guarded habits. They formed a bond that outlasted careers and addresses. For Robert, Susan was a confident listener. For Susan, Robert was a friend who paid attention and, crucially, paid bills when work dried up. The psychology of their bond is important. Both felt like outsiders in elite rooms. Both distrusted institutions. Both prized private confidences over public explanations. Susan could be fiercely loyal, almost protective, and Robert responded to that with money transfers and steady contact. Investigators later confirmed financial support moving from him to her, especially in periods when he needed silence more than advice. But here is the twist. That loyalty, which looked like friendship, would place her at the center of the missing wife case 18 years after the disappearance. In 1982, as investigators considered alibis and timelines in Kathie's disappearance, a possibility surfaced. Someone close to Robert might have helped stage the call that excused Kathie from her Monday duties. The person would need familiarity with Kathie's school, her schedule, the tone that would make a dean accept a sudden absence. Susan Berman fit that profile. An experienced communicator who understood performance, who could sound authoritative over a phone line. There was no tape, no phone record that confirmed her voice, but the theory took root because it explained the precision of that one convenient call. For years, nothing broke. Robert drifted away from New York, then back again. Susan remained in Los Angeles, writing, struggling with money, tending to dogs, talking with friends about the older days. Then the case reawakened. Around 2000, New York investigators reopened Kathie's disappearance, pushed by sustained pressure from her friends and new attention from media. Old names regained relevance. Susan heard whispers that detectives wanted to talk. She anticipated a knock on the door. Did she fear being treated as an accessory? Did she expect to clarify the past? Friends say she was anxious, but calm. In late December 2000, the silence ended with a single gunshot. Susan Berman was found in her Benedict Canyon home, shot behind the ear, execution style, on the floor near the entrance. There was no sign of forced entry, no ransacking, no theft. The scene suggested familiarity. She likely knew the person, opened the door, turned her back. In homicide work, that entry wound implies trust or surprise. The act felt clean, calculated, and quick. And then, almost immediately, Los Angeles police received a strange alert. A brief note arrived, postmarked, addressed to Beverly Hills Police. The word Beverly was misspelled with an extra E, an unusual and unsettling error. The letter said a cadaver could be found at Susan's address. Cadaver is a clinical term, not common in everyday speech when reporting a death. Why send it at all? Investigators considered staging. Someone wanted the body discovered promptly, perhaps to avoid decomposition that could obscure timing, perhaps to manage the discovery narrative. The letter was a breadcrumb, but it did not name the sender, and there were no usable fingerprints. What stands out now, in hindsight, is how that single misspelling became a hinge. Years later, handwriting comparisons would link a known envelope from Robert Durst to an almost identical misspelling, the same awkward Beverly. But at the time, 2000 into early 2001, detectives catalogued the letter and focused on people in Susan's orbit. Robert's name was obvious. He had motive if the theory was witness elimination. Susan had the potential to connect him to the 1982 alibi. He had means, money, travel, access. He had history, increasing scrutiny back east. The timing matched the reopening in New York. Yet, as in Kathie's case, hard proof lagged. Meanwhile, the psychology of the moment is important. If someone feared Susan would talk, they would also understand her habits. She did not bolt chains in the daytime. She let friends in without checking IDs. She trusted the familiar. The lack of forced entry supports that. No sign of struggle, no barrage of shots, just a single, efficient wound behind the ear. That is staging in effect. Minimal noise, minimal mess, maximal certainty. Investigators canvassed neighbors, tracked phone calls, and reconstructed her final days. She had received money from Robert not long before, a pattern consistent with their relationship. She was expecting holiday visitors, juggling small errands, responding to calls from journalists chasing the revived Kathie story. The window of death fit a life in motion, not a person planning to disappear. In homicide work, sudden death paired with a looming interview is not a coincidence, it is a red flag. The letter kept pulling attention back. Beverly Hills Police. The extra E felt like a signature, not by design but by habit. Handwriting experts later drew comparisons between that envelope and one connected to Robert. At first, though, the case was a stalemate. No eyewitnesses, no camera footage of the shooter, no confession. Susan's murder drifted toward the cold case shelf, even as its gravity deepened the pattern. When pressure rose around the 1982 disappearance, a potential witness died. And yet, for all this, it was not over. The bond that once protected Robert now formed a corridor toward him. Friends remembered Susan's unwavering loyalty, but also her loneliness near the end, the financial stress, the desire to be seen. If she had knowledge about Kathie's disappearance, she carried it quietly for nearly 2 decades. The letter announcing her death turned the private into public, a chilling message that defined the crime more than any scream would have. In the aftermath, Los Angeles detectives weighed handwriting, access, motive, and timing. New York investigators watched closely. The two files, once separate, began to echo each other. A missing wife, an alibi call, a confidant who might have made it, then an execution and a misspelled word. What if the same hand threaded through both? Years later, the cameras would roll, the envelopes would be compared on screen, and a bathroom whisper would push everything forward. But in December 2000, it was just a door opening to a familiar face. And then the sound of one shot. While Los Angeles detectives weighed handwriting and access, another storm built in Texas. Robert Durst left the coasts and slipped into Galveston, a working port town where anonymity came cheap. He rented a small, shabby apartment in a low-rise building near the water. And then came the disguise. He presented as a mute woman, an older, quiet tenant, head down, eyes averted. Why mute? Because a voice gives you away. In hindsight, the psychology of the moment is important. He wanted an erasure so complete. Even language was a risk. Neighbors noticed him, but not for long. In places like this, people mind their own business. Rent gets paid, doors close early, the wind off the bay covers the rest. Across the hall lived Morris Black. Volatile, lonely, known for outbursts. He had moved often, had little patience for noise, and argued about small things as if they were insults. The building manager recalled tension, something about trash, shared sinks, loud television at odd hours. Morris was the kind of neighbor who kept a mental ledger of grievances. What stands out now, in retrospect, is how proximity built pressure. Robert, inside his disguise, tried to fade from sight. Morris, sensitive to intrusions, noticed incongruities. He saw Dorothy Sena, the name Durst used, and sensed something off. Mannerisms, the way the woman carried himself, the sudden silence when someone came near. Investigators later suggested Morris might have discovered Robert's identity, or at least suspected he was hiding from something. That suspicion, if voiced, could puncture the erasure. September 2001. The bay gave up what it had been asked to keep. Garbage bags, bobbing just below the surface, tore open. Inside were dismembered human remains, pale against the dark water, the head missing. Police traced the bags, the brand of ties, the cut patterns. The trail led back to that low-rise building, to the apartment with the odd tenant. Blood traces were found, saws, receipts for trash bags, a timeline of cleanup. The staging was not elegant. It was rushed, almost frantic. When officers knocked, the apartment looked like a workshop of second chances. Bleach, towels, a refrigerator that had held more than food. And yet, the most important piece of forensic evidence, the head, was missing. Without it, autopsy conclusions would be limited. Entry wounds, trajectory, exact cause of death, all clouded. But a driver's license pulled from the trash made the identification Morris Black, the neighbor, the man across the hall. Durst fled, briefly. He was picked up in Pennsylvania on a separate shoplifting incident, a strange, almost compulsive theft of a sandwich and bandages, despite cash on him. The act felt like a crack in control. Extradited to Texas, he faced the core question. Why was Morris Black in pieces in the bay? And how did that happen inside an apartment he rented under an alias, in a disguise designed to erase identity? In court, the defense presented a stark, simple story. Self-defense. They claimed a struggle over a handgun in the apartment. Morris, agitated, had found the weapon and pointed it. A fight followed, a shot fired, accidental, then panic. Durst, they argued, was a man with reason to fear police attention, wanted elsewhere for questioning, tied to another homicide investigation. He made a terrible choice. He dismembered the body to hide the death, not because he murdered with intent, but because he feared being blamed. It is a disturbing claim, but it can work on a jury because it separates the act of killing from the act of disposal. The prosecution leaned on the brutality. Dismemberment is not what people do when truth is on their side. The saw cuts, the cleanup, the bags in the bay, this was calculated. They emphasized the head's absence. Without a skull, you cannot chart the bullet's path. You cannot prove whether there was a close contact shot, consistent with a struggle or a neat execution. The missing head became both evidence of staging and a hole in the state's case. The defense exploited that hole. In a courtroom, doubt does not need a full story. It needs a gap big enough for one question. Are you sure? Jurors listened to forensic testimony about cut marks that suggested a methodical process, learned about saws purchased at local stores, heard about bleach patterns and drain residues. They also learned about Morris Black's temperament. The defense painted him as combustible, a man who could escalate quickly. One analogy hovered over deliberations: a plane crash with no black box. You have wreckage, smoke, and trajectories, but the decisive audio is missing. The head was the black box. Why the disguise? Why the flight to Galveston? The defense reframed it as a practical measure. He was a wealthy man under a cloud of suspicion from a case he claimed he did not commit, so he hid to avoid what he considered media harassment and prosecutorial overreach. From their perspective, his choice to live as a mute woman was not proof of murderous intent, it was proof of paranoia. Jurors do not have to like a defendant to think the state has not proved its charge beyond a reasonable doubt. What happened in that apartment? In the defense version, a scuffle, a gun, a single chaotic moment, then panic and erasure. In the state's version, an intentional killing of a man who had become a liability, followed by meticulous dismemberment. The forensic evidence could not bridge the gap, and in criminal law, when evidence cannot cross, the defendant walks. The verdict stunned many. Acquitted of murder, convicted of evidence tampering and bail jumping, the jury, interviewed later, described the psychological bind. The dismemberment was monstrous, but the prosecution had not proved the shooting was intentional. The absence of the head, the lack of a clear autopsy conclusion, and the plausible story of a struggle created uncertainty they could not ignore. The psychology of juror uncertainty is not softness. It is the system working as designed, proof, or freedom. In the aftermath, he walked out of a Texas courtroom not as an innocent man in a moral sense, but as a legally acquitted one on the homicide count. He served time for the tampering, but the larger narrative remained unsettled. Why choose Galveston? Why the disguise? Why a neighbor dead? The pattern is what matters. When pressure rose, New York reopening, Los Angeles circling a confidant, he vanished into a place where voices blur and faces dissolve. And when proximity pierced that bubble, another erasure followed, this time with saws and tides. What nobody knew at the time was that this acquittal would not close the loop. It sharpened it. Filmmakers were already threading timelines. Handwriting experts were already tracking that extra E. The Texas verdict gave Robert Durst the confidence to speak again, to sit down, to perform control on camera. And when control slips, words leak. The next act would move from a small apartment in Galveston to a quiet bathroom in Los Angeles, where a whisper would sound like a confession. When filmmakers approached Robert Durst, they were not chasing spectacle. They were chasing contradictions. The Jinx set out to map timelines, to test stories against documents, to see where language buckled under detail. From the first interview, his cadence was measured, his gaze steady, his answers clipped. He presented as cooperative but controlled. The psychology of the moment is important. A man acquitted in Texas, unindicted for his wife's disappearance, uncharged in Los Angeles, now believed he could manage his narrative. They started with paper, envelopes, notes, address books. The investigative spine was handwriting. An old letter Durst wrote, addressing Beverly Hills, surfaced from his own records. The extra E, the same unusual and unsettling misspelling that marked the cadaver note sent after Susan Berman's killing, leapt off the page. Side by side, the misspelling was not the only echo. The block letters, the spacing, the slant, the way Hills sat a touch higher. Handwriting analysis is not DNA, but patterns matter when they repeat with precision. But here is the twist. Before the big reveal, the production kept him talking. He was asked about Kathie, about Susan, about Galveston. He deflected with practiced lines, then wandered into tangents that felt like tests of power. He corrected trivial facts, as if asserting control through minutiae. He denied knowing who sent the cadaver note. He said he would never write Beverly. The filmmakers did not argue, they documented. In true crime work, you do not fight the subject. You invite him to restate the claim. Meanwhile, they refined the forensic backbone. A document examiner walked through similarities, one stroke at a time, building a chain of resemblance. They were not declaring certainty. They were showing overlap, letting the audience see what investigators had suspected. The Beverly misspelling functioned like a fingerprint smudged by time, not perfect, but distinctive. And then the production made a choice. Confront him on camera with the two exemplars. When the pages slid across the table, his eyes tracked the letters. He did not look surprised, not in the immediate sense. He looked annoyed that the comparison existed at all. He tried distance, saying, "Lots of people misspell things." He tried sarcasm, He tried the shrug. Yet the visuals did what cross-examination often cannot. They allowed viewers to judge without a lawyer's filter. 2 envelopes, 1 habit. The interviews grew tenser. He asked for breaks. He sipped water. He stared at the floor a touch longer before answering. The filmmakers kept the pace slow and deliberate. They were not hunters, they were archivists. And still, the trap was not the confrontation. It was the microphone. After 1 session, he stood, gathered himself, and walked to the bathroom, still wearing the wireless mic. This is common in production. Microphones are removed by crew, not by interviewees. Inside the small, tiled room, he whispered to himself, a habit of rehearsing thoughts aloud. The muttered sequence came out in fragments, not a polished confession, but a raw monologue of a pressured mind. There it is. You are caught. Then, phrases broken by breath and the clink of water. The line that would echo everywhere. Killed them all, of course. Context matters. He also said things like, "What the hell did I do? And you are right." The filmmakers later emphasized that the audio required careful assembly, with redacted bathroom sounds and edits for clarity. Even so, the psychological impact was blunt. What stands out now, in hindsight, is less the sentence than the setting. Alone, unwatched, he did not build a legal defense. He narrated panic. He argued with himself. He tried on the role of the guilty, then the innocent, then the clever. It sounded like someone hearing a House of Cards slide. Prosecutors, when they finally heard it, did not treat it as a standalone confession. They treated it as a piece of a pattern, combined with the handwriting, with travel records, with money transfers to Susan before her death, with the 1982 disappearance. Public pressure spiked. The show aired in episodes, each one tightening the screws. Viewers became witnesses, not to a murder, but to a man corroded by detail. Law enforcement watched too. In Los Angeles, detectives reassessed the Berman file. In New York, the Kathie case stirred. Texas had already spoken, but the broader pattern, erasure in 3 states, was suddenly visible, clear enough for a jury to follow someday. The psychology of the moment is important. Once an audience accepts the coherence of a pattern, individual doubts shrink. The filmmakers pressed again on the cadaver letter. If he did not write it, who did? If he did not, why did his known envelope mirror the same odd misspelling? He reached for coincidence, for the fog of memory. He said he could not recall writing that particular Beverly. He allowed that he had written many notes, that he had addressed many envelopes. Yet the misspelling was rare. Locals do not write Beverly by accident. It reads like someone who did not live there, someone recalling the name as sound, not habit. For investigators, the misspelling was a door. The bathroom audio was the foot wedged in the frame. Still, the case needed more than theatre. It needed logistics. Travel records placed him near Los Angeles, around the time of Susan's death. Financial records showed transfers to Susan. Phone records sketched proximity. None of this proved he pulled the trigger, but it drew a path so narrow it was hard to miss the destination. And then production timing met prosecutorial timing. As the finale neared, an arrest warrant moved toward signature. Authorities had weighed the risk of flight, the likelihood of success, the mixed reliability of documentary evidence in a courtroom. The Jinx did not create a case. It exposed seams in a story that had held for decades. In that exposure, old proof gained new weight. Jurors do not hear shows, they hear evidence. But jurors also understand human behavior. A man hiding as a mute woman, a neighbor in pieces, a confidant dead with a neat letter pointing police to her body, a bathroom whisper. What nobody knew at first was whether the audio would survive legal scrutiny, chain of custody, editing context, authenticity. Prosecutors prepared for challenges. They did not bet everything on the sentence. They built from the bottom up. Motive in 1982, opportunity in 2000, consciousness of guilt in 2001, handwriting across years. The arrest that followed the finale was not a stunt. It was a signal. The narrative had converged with the law. Meanwhile, in New York, the language began to change. Missing, edged toward, presumed dead. And with that shift, doors opened. Detectives returned to the old file with a colder eye, this time less impressed by pedigree, more focused on pattern. Friends who had held their own archives were contacted again. They brought affidavits, calendars, notes from calls that had haunted them since 1982. The psychology of the moment is important. When a system signals belief, witnesses speak with fewer hedges. Renewed statements recounted bruises, late-night pleas, threats framed as warnings. A former neighbor remembered hearing shouting through walls, then silence that felt staged. A classmate recalled a call where Kathie said she could not keep pretending. In these recountings, detail mattered less as spectacle and more as consistency. The same episodes surfaced across different voices. Investigators compared phrasing, cross-referenced dates, tested whether memories aligned with records. Many did. And then there was the Dean's call. Records were reconsidered. Phone logs did not authenticate the voice, and the timing did not sit cleanly against known movements. The alleged call had always been a linchpin. Now investigators treated it as an insertion, not a fact. They probed who had motive and means to place it. A woman's voice would have been expected, an intimate's vocabulary more convincing. The alibi began to fracture, not because of one new revelation, but because old evidence was finally interpreted with the context of coercive control. Searches broadened. A lake property, storage units once linked to Robert, even the narrative of that Sunday night, was replotted minute by minute, asking whether a train was plausible given weather, station staffing, and observable sightings. Conductors were re-interviewed. Cab companies from the period were checked for any lingering archives. Most of it yielded nothing, which, ironically, helped. Absence can function as structure when the rest of the story anticipates presence. A person so dutiful at the hospital simply does not ghost a rotation without fallback plans. What stands out now, in hindsight, is how the social record carried as much weight as the physical. Friends described how Kathie hoarded textbooks, saved notes for exams, kept her life in folders. Those folders were still in her apartment after she vanished, along with daily use items you do not leave behind for long. Investigators catalogued these as anchors: toothbrush, winter coat, identification spares. Taken together, they argued against voluntary departure. Grand jury interest followed. Prosecutors tested the viability of a no-body homicide, assembling a timeline that highlighted motive, opportunity, prior violence, and the creation of a false alibi. They understood the hurdle. Beyond a reasonable doubt without a body requires a narrative so coherent that jurors feel the victim's presence through what she left behind. The psychology of juror certainty shifts when silence looks engineered rather than accidental. But here is the twist. Even as momentum gathered, attention tilted west to the killing with tangible forensics. Susan Berman's. California had a body, a scene, a letter. New York had a history that explained why a witness might be eliminated. Prosecutors in both states coordinated informally, recognizing that pattern evidence could travel. The goal was not to blend cases, but to let them rhyme where the law allows. Motive from 1982, explaining conduct in 2000. Witness preparation intensified. Friends who had been sidelined now stood at the center, their credibility vetted and supported by corroborating detail. One recounted a night when Kathie appeared at her door, tearful, whispering that she feared what might happen if she left for good. Another remembered seeing money turned into leverage, small allowances contingent on obedience. None of this proved homicide. All of it made the alternative, voluntary disappearance, feel implausible. Investigators also confronted their own past delays. Reports that had been minimized were now read for what they were: early warnings. A prior police call, once logged as domestic disturbance without follow-up, was recontextualized as escalation. The train claim, once accepted as a neat endpoint, was reframed as a narrative choice by a man who benefited from ambiguity. These internal corrections mattered because they signaled to a jury that institutional blind spots had been addressed. The question hovered. Without a body, could motive, history, and circumstantial evidence meet the standard? Prosecutors built toward a cautious yes, while acknowledging risk. They drafted around the Dean call, showing why it was likely staged. They situated Kathie's ambitions as evidence of future orientation, the opposite of self-erasure. They underscored the tight timeline between the last known contact and Robert's tidy account. In the background, the Jinx had awakened public attention, but the legal work moved on its own rails. Subpoenas for financial transfers, travel records, even mail habits, stacked into a portrait of a man who managed consequences rather than faced them. New York's case gained weight, but the practical path to a courtroom ran through Los Angeles, where a single bullet and a misspelled word were already forming a charge sheet. All roads were converging, not by design, but by the gravity of a pattern finally recognized. All roads converged on Los Angeles. Prosecutors framed the theory plainly. Susan Berman was killed to prevent her from speaking about the 1982 disappearance. Money transfers before the murder suggested leverage. A scheduled approach by investigators created pressure. The entry wound behind the ear, the lack of forced entry, the familiarity with her habits, These details, they argued, pointed to someone she trusted. The Beverly Hills Police cadaver letter became the forensic spine. Handwriting experts stepped through stroke comparisons, spacing, and slant, then paused on the rare misspelling, mirrored on a known envelope, linked to Robert Durst. Jurors were told this was not DNA, it was a distinctive habit. The state layered travel records, financial logs, and prior statements. Pattern evidence from Kathie's disappearance was admitted for motive, not character. The psychology of the moment is important. Jurors were asked to see coherence, not coincidence. The defense countered by attacking reliability. They suggested alternative suspects within Susan's circle, questioned documentary editing practices, and challenged the probative value of the bathroom audio. They urged caution. The cadaver letter's author was not filmed writing it. The handwriting discipline has margins of error, and the misspelling could be an unfortunate overlap. They reframed the relationship as generosity, not conspiracy, and cast Robert as an eccentric man, hounded by narrative rather than proof. Witnesses walked the jury through decades. Friends of Kathie described abuse and fear, not to retry New York, but to show motive for silencing Susan. Handwriting experts explained why the Beverly quirk mattered. Detectives described the scene's familiarity. Then Robert took the stand, unusually calm, measured, denying the letter, denying the shooting, conceding odd choices, Galveston disguise, movements, while insisting innocence in Los Angeles. But here's the twist. The state did not need a single smoking gun. It needed a pattern that held under pressure. The cadaver letter's misspelling, the envelope echo, the timing of payments, the impending inquiry, the quiet entry, the execution wound, each piece reinforced the next. Jurors watched the pattern settle. The verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Life in prison.